If old videos from the main times were to be believed, then the time after such an horrible accident as the one that happened to Cart Logistics should be a solemn time. A vigil should be held, where the dead would be treated with respect and sent out on the last journey across the void towards the nearest star. But on board of temporary setback and mostly functional, no one had time for that. In his tiny, cramped medbay, which was actually a repurposed maintenance closet, Dr. Disco did all he could for the wounded, but it was clear that the two people who were caught in the explosion would not be able to return to work anytime soon, and would have to be dismissed. This wasn't a charity organization after all. And the rest of the crew were too busy covering for those who were lost, and even though everyone worked day and night, it simply wasn't enough to keep complicated beasts that were spaceships fully operational, and some malfunctions started happening almost immediately. Faulty wires here, glitches in power capacitors there, and, mere day later, Mr. Card decided that they can't keep up like this, and, despite having oh so many reasons to avoid Tritakian Corporation, plotted a course to an outpost of Tibicena, where the company had a small port. Luckily, Tritac Security was, like the rest of the company, based on pure profits and efficiency, and as long as there wasn't any active bounty on you, they didn't care at all who docked in their stations, be it pirates, smugglers or regular traders, with only exceptions being the members of the Luddite Path, but let's be honest, they weren't welcome anywhere. Still, Mr. Cart and his second-in-command Varuna decided that it would be a bad idea to show up on Tibicena station in person, and decided to stay on the ship and make all the deals through their ship's console, while some of the more socially capable crew members were sent down to the dock to find replacements for the lost crew. Unfortunately, besides Varuna, the least socially inept person turned out to be Dr. Disco, whose recruiting spiel went a bit like this. "Greetings, prospective spacers," he said, sticking like a sore thumb in a corp bar filled with grey-faced office drones and exhausted wage-slave workers. "I represent Cart Logistics Company, which currently is looking for capable employers to replace the ones we lost to a pirate trap few days ago. Currently, from my experience, life expectancy of the newly employed operators oscillates around 2 and 4 days, and I'm not flying with this outfit long enough to tell you if they pay on time." "Remind me to have a talk about the virtue of honesty with the good doctor," Mr. Cart said to Varuna as he listened to this recruiting talk through his implants. The woman just hid her face in her hands and said nothing, shaking her head. But whether you worked for hegemony, Tritac, pirates or some independent, unrecognized government, life was usually equally miserable for the lowest ring of society in the sector, and even though Dr. Disco's speech should have scared off everyone, he still came back to the vessel with 10 brand new recruits who would risk anything just to stop doing spreadsheets for Tritac executives. Not a gram of experience between all of them, sure, but they were all willing to learn, and to Mr. Cart that was more than enough. Once the new ones were on board, the crew decided to not hang around pointlessly and moved on. This time, to an outlaw-controlled station going by the name of Canta's Den, because even if they couldn't find work there, they'd almost certainly find themselves a good trading opportunity. You see, there was this very common misconception about pirates of the sector. Namely, people believed that they spent their every waking hour doing, well, pirating. But the truth was that piracy was never really all that viable. It's expensive, dangerous, the risks are often greater than rewards, and when spaceships are involved, it requires logistics that no mindless brigand could organize. And so, when the armadas of rust buckets belonging to various warlords were not pillaging their way across the stars, they mostly were either just docked and gathered dust, or simply transported goods manufactured by one of the many side businesses said warlords had. On some worlds, like Garnier or Umbra, it was simple mining, and pirate captains would then transport the raw minerals to whoever offered the best price for it. But it was not always just some basic industry. Take Captain Starworks, for example. Technically, a station overrun by outlaws, but also one of the greatest refineries in the sector, always hungry for more metals to smelt and turn into whatever was profitable. Or, indeed, the Canta's Den, which found its own special niche, namely consumer goods. The civilization might have been just a shadow of its former self, but people were still people. They were lazy, so there was always demand for domestic or work tools that could do one's job for them. And they were also vain, and everyone loved to surround themselves with symbols of their own wealth and decadence, or simply wanted to own something that would help with monotony of everyday life. But if, say, an office worker from Sindria wanted a holoprojector to play some games after long hours of work, he'd have two choices. Option 1, go to official market and buy an overpriced toy from a national manufacturer. Option 2, go to some back street and get the same toy, granted with every bit of data mining software the pirates could put into it, at quarter of the price, and that was where the craftsmen of Cantor's Den came in. Being outlaws, they cared very little about established tariffs, taxes, or other nonsense, and simply smuggled whatever they made to whoever needed it, usually at a fraction of the price officials wanted. And yes, it meant that people who were raided by pirates also lined up their pockets by buying goods from them, but when price difference was so high, no one really complained or cared. But perhaps most interestingly, craftsmen of Cantor's Den were the main providers of toys for kids, a market that was, otherwise, almost completely barren. Tritachyon Corp looked only at the numbers and potential income, and kids, understandably, had almost no disposable income, so there was no point to manufacture things for them. The Luddite Church frowned upon all heretical mechanical machines or electronic devices which, in their minds, distracted their youth from learning about the words of the Prophet and living simple, honest lives. And Sindria, Hegemony, and the League preferred their kids either working in factories from early age, or training for life in the military, or, the worst option, life of never-ending drudgery as a wage-slave worker. And that meant that if kids wanted anything to play with, it was Cantor's Den that supplied them. Hence, even more interestingly, while the Warlord's craftsmen were not above shoving an entire suite of espionage software, or explosives, if they were feeling particularly funny, into other goods they produced, when they made toys, they made them to the highest possible standard and as safe as possible. Some thought that they wanted to use this to appeal to kids, so that when they eventually grew up, they'd be less hostile towards Cantor's raiders. Some believed that this was a proof that Warlord Cantor wasn't as much of a murderous psychopath as some thought her to be. And the kids themselves liked to joke that no one, not even commander of one of the greatest pirates fleet in the sector, wanted to mess with Persean urchins. And believe me, if you'd ever find yourself in the crosshairs of one of those bands of underage delinquents, you'd think them worse than all pirates across the stars combined. But what all this ultimately meant was that the crew of Cart Logistics didn't even have to look hard to find some very lucrative deals. When their ships arrived at Cantor's Den, the warehouses and markets were overflowing with all manners of consumer and luxury goods in all shapes and sizes. Within 2 hours, both vessels of Cart Logistics were loaded up from top to bottom, undocked, and plotted a course back to Nova Maxius where, as many snickering merchants said, the goods they picked up were right now in an extremely high demand. Varuna, on her usual trip to the local watering hole, even managed to score a deal for a return trip, as apparently a concerned citizen approached with a request for repair and maintenance supplies. He then added, with a very honest look on his face, that this request was in no way tied to dozens of pirate warships that were moored in the docks and were currently undergoing repairs after their, as he described it, heroic adventures in the void. Varuna wasn't sure why he was lying, but she played along with this entire pantomime. She felt that the man deserved it for the effort he put into it, and he didn't even look like a pirate. But only on her way back to the ship, Varuna realized that the supplies the man wanted could also be picked up at Nova Maxius, which would make this round trip quite profitable indeed, especially since the man was willing to pay way above usual market prices to get his ordered commodities as quickly as possible. In fact, the price was so high that Mr. Cart got a bit suspicious. "You sure this isn't some kind of a setup?" he asked Varuna when their ships were leaving the docks. "Paying this much for basic goods sounds a bit too desperate to me." "Aye, 'cause the man probably is desperate," the woman replied from her post on the bridge. "My bet is that the guy is in charge of one of the Cantor's raider fleets, and he and his lads got their asses handed to them when they tried to pillage some convoy. Even if they managed to overpower the escorts, they still would have bought their freighters enough time to escape, and that means no payday for the raiders. So now the guy's probably just trying to save face and get his ships back in working order, without actually admitting that he screwed up." In response to that, another line opened on the comms. Alternatively, the guy wants an upper hand over his fellow captains, the one-eyed former Patha lady said from her ship. And how would paying such an outrageous sum for basic goods help him do that, Sister Zala? Mr. Cart asked. Not sister anymore, I told you. Zala is enough, Zala replied, annoyed. And I saw this kind of behavior amongst some of the Patha captains. Once a big raid, or, well, a big crusade as they called it, was done, all combat groups were recalled back to the dock for repairs. But if one captain finished their repairs before everyone else, they could go out there and do more raiding, and even steal some of the crew of other captains as they were waiting for their own ships to get back in action. So, this guy may just want to get his supplies so he can go out there as soon as possible and raid to his heart's content without any competition. Makes sense, Mr. Cart said. His helmeted head nodded on the screen and Varuna did the same on her end. They never walked with the Luddite path before, so Sister Zala certainly brought her own unique perspective into the mix, and only now they began to realize that this perspective may indeed be quite valuable. But there were more people there on the bridge with Varuna, most of whom showed only passing interest in the conversation, busy with their own duties. But one young man, also wearing Ludic robes, but not of the more radical path but of the moderate church, stood up, his face red with anger. I'm sorry for interrupting, Captain, Lieutenant, Sister, but I can't just sit still while you're talking nonsense like that. He turned his eyes to Varuna. Lieutenant, when you hired us, you said that we were going to be a logistics company, not vultures profiting from others' suffering. The man spouted all of that in a single breath, and then instinctively lowered his head, expecting a scalding or an order to throw himself out the airlock. But no such thing came. I'm glad you're voicing your objections. Brother Jesselton, was it? Mr. Cart said through the main comm screen. I told all of you when you first came on board. This is not a military ship. You have something to say? Say it. I'd rather discuss the matter with you in private first, Captain, the Luddite said. Tough shit, Brother Jesselton, Mr. Cart replied, and, as if to punctuate his words, the visor of his helmet turned red. You'll either talk with me like this, over comms, or not at all. Fine, the man said, surprised by the strict refusal. The truth is that when the lieutenant here hired us, she said we'd be working for a transport company. I expected that we might delve into some illegal business, maybe smuggle some goods not approved by the church. But what we're doing right now makes us no better than these pirates. Hell, the cargo we have in our hold still has some markings from Nova Maxius, which means the raiders stole it, and now here we are, dragging it back to the people who were already attacked and robbed, just to sell them their own goods at an inflated price. Then by your logic, brother, pretty much every single merchant in the sector is a war profiteer. We're not doing anything out of the ordinary, we're merely responding to a market shortage. Yes, a market shortage caused by thieves and murderers, and we even lined their pockets while we're at it. No decent man should do something like that. Varuna shook her head at that and remembered her Navy days, and the far darker time before them, when she was often sent with her squad on special missions. And those missions, on many occasions, were not aimed at the enemies themselves, but at their warehouses, or even ones belonging to neutral or even allied parties, which, in a weird coincidence, always seemed to contain goods that Varuna's employers had in abundance as well. She decided to not share this knowledge with Brother Jesselton. His innocent soul probably wouldn't be able to take it. All I'm saying is that it feels mighty hypocritical of us to take part in this exchange and pretend that we're no better than the scum from Cantor's Den, the Luddite said. Mr. Cart was about to reply something, but Sister Zala barged in on the comm from her ship. Brother, take it from me as a former follower of the path, we're not really the ones to talk about hypocrisy here, seeing as our faith seemed to contradict itself at every step. You're here, right? On a spaceship, fueled by what our priests call Infernium. But should you be here, brother? No, you should be down on some planet, tending to a farm, or, I don't know, working as a carpenter or some other boring grounder nonsense. Should the church itself have its fleets, filled with warships that Lud himself considered to be anathema? Of course they shouldn't, and yet they do, just like they use machinery and technology they consider evil every day, just to build more and more of said warships. It's to prepare the sector for salvation, sister, Jesselton started, but the one-eyed woman cut him off. Yes, I know, I heard this tripe before. from pathers who lived most of their lives in space, no less, even though they shouldn't even look at the stars. Except we had 2 centuries, and it doesn't look like anything changed in that time. In fact, it feels like we're still using Lud as an excuse to do whatever the hell we want, without even thinking about what he actually said and wanted for us. And don't call me sister. I'm done with that life for good. Brother Jesselton wanted to say something, but Mr. Cart was faster. Look, I understand where you're coming from, kid, and I appreciate your sense of justice. If the sector was filled with people like you, then there'd be no need for such a discussion. But people are not as good as you, brother, and, pardon my defeatism, I don't see a way of making them better. So the only other choice we have is to look out for ourselves and at least try to be as decent as we can. You said that we're no better than pirates, but think about it. When I said that we're not a combat unit, I meant it. I do not intend to go out there and raid shipping lanes with you, if only because it's not even remotely as profitable as ferrying cargo. So, if our company took these goods, which were on Kanta's market anyway, then we'll use the profits to make ourselves safer. And that's it. But think what would happen if one of Kanta's raiders decided to sell those goods. What do you think they'd spend their newfound money on? Warships, that's what. Warships they'd use to raid and murder more people. So yes, we may not be honorable, sure, but given the circumstances it could be worse, and that's really all we can hope for in this godforsaken sector. Don't speak Lord's name in vain, Captain, Jesselton said, and then, seeing cold glares, quickly added, Please. Don't worry, won't happen too often. But as I was saying, I respect your opinion on the matter and your integrity, brother. But I won't have you questioning decisions I make to keep this company afloat. This is not a Syndrian work camp. You can leave anytime you want. Hell, if we're ever around Gilead, we can drop you off there and you can live in one of those farming communities they have. Or, if that doesn't satisfy you, the airlock is right there, Varuna added with a murderous glint in her eye, ending the conversation. Although it was clear to everyone who looked at Brother Jesselton's face that he didn't say his last word yet. Still, there were no more heated debates on the way back to Nova Maxius, where the locals eagerly paid a massively inflated sum of escrows for the goods that, in some cases, belonged to them just a few weeks ago. In fact, the business was so good that Cart Logistics made another round trip, since they still had to return to Kantas then with supplies they bought. And indeed, it was inevitable that supplies sold by people of the Independent Station would be used by pirate fleets that poisoned their lives, but that was just the sad reality for most of the inhabitants of Persean Sector. You made your money where you could and hoped to survive another day, even if that meant that you had to make deals with someone who held a gun to your head some time ago. But of course, it didn't mean that the people of Nova Maxius were just cowardly pushovers. Sure, they were raided here and there, but they always punched back, and, as a result, when the second sale of consumer goods was done, the market on the station was full of weapons of all shapes and sizes, most of which were taken from the less fortunate pirates who didn't make it. And since weapons were a commodity that was in high demand pretty much everywhere, given the dangerous nature of the sector, it was pretty much a sure deal, bound to make a healthy profit. And so, Cart Logistics, with heavy artillery and dismantled tanks in their cargo holds, flew back to Asharu to, as they said, help the law enforcement ensure stability of the planetary population, by whatever means necessary. The truth, however, was of course different. After their assault on Garni, Hegemony Garrison placed on Asharu left, but as they did so, they took pretty much all of the heavy armaments with them, leaving the locals defenseless, and local raiders, both planetary and extrasolar ones, were already starting to circle like vultures, which meant that Council of Asharu was willing to pay whatever money they could scrounge up to bolster their defenses, and that's where Cart Logistics made another good sale. So good, in fact, that they decided to treat themselves to another ship, a Hermes-class shuttle renamed CLS Harmless, because that was very much what it was. A cargo hold, some engines, a surprisingly decent crew compartment, one could even call it luxurious for Persean standards, and a few weapons which were mostly for show. Still, it was perfect addition as yet another small cargo hauler, and command of it was soon handed over to one of the more experienced crewmen, who called himself Ludwig. Even better for cart logistics, though, was the fact that as they arrived, a harvesting season was in full swing on Asharu, and so, when they left the planet a few days later, their ships were filled to the brim with food, which was apparently desperately needed by the Luddite Church in their outpost of Bara Shipyard. Apparently, some of their convoys from Gilead never made it, and the shipyard's population was on the verge of starvation, which meant it was a perfect opportunity for a small merchant fleet full of cheaply bought food. A few days later, a small, unmarked and unidentified shuttle docked at the shipyard, and Varuna, together with a handful of more professional crewmates, disembarked onto the station to look for a potential buyer, one that would preferably allow them to bypass the ridiculously high tariffs imposed by the local bishop. Fortunately, with the population growing more and more desperate with every day, it took her less than an hour to find a businessman like that, and she met with him in one of the local tea houses. Alcohol, after all, was frowned upon by the church. They sat at separate tables, but still close to each other, stared at the screen, which showed transmissions of the ongoing mass, and, over the sounds of bells and chimes, began negotiations. A few minutes later, Varuna nodded, still staring at the screen, and the man next to her raised his cup slightly. Then, they both performed usual farewell of Persian black marketeers, which is to say they left the tea house in separate directions, while pretending like this entire exchange never happened. But as Varuna walked back towards the dock, she suddenly realized she was being observed. With a slow, seemingly innocent move, she reached towards her pistol, but in that moment a voice right next to her said, "Lud's peace upon you, sister. You won't be needing that weapon. I do not aim to cause you any trouble." She quickly turned to the source of the voice, which turned out to be a man standing in an alcove. He was dressed as your typical Luddite preacher, a quarterstaff made out of genuine actual wood and absolutely no visible implants to speak of. Although, Varuna corrected herself, that only meant his exposed parts, that is to say face and hands, and even that wasn't too clear because the man was slightly obscured by smoke from a cigar he was smoking. "You do not need to stare at me like that, sister," he said between drags. "As you can clearly see, I am not even armed. So, if you would be so kind, would you be willing to share a few moments of your time with me?" "Apologies, sir, but I'm in a hurry," Varuna replied, seeing that the man already pulled out a small book from his robe. No doubt preaching was about to happen. "But I'll surely be back in a few days, and then we can talk." "I'm sorry, but what is this, nonsense?" the man said, acting as if the woman wasn't trying to leave. "Aren't we all brothers and sisters in Lud? So I beg you, sister, talk with me for but a moment. After all, these are dark times, and while you may indeed be willing to come back, who can say if you will be able to? The end times are upon us, and the sector is dangerous for everyone," he said, and then, after a few seconds of silence, he added, "especially for those who parade their unholy, mechanically modified bodies around." Varuna's eyes darted from side to side, securing an escape route. She could take down the priest if the worst come to pass, but such action would no doubt have grave consequences on a station controlled by the church. Still, she moved her hands towards her sidearm, fully expecting a confrontation, but the man raised his hands and smiled. "Sister, please, I fear you have mistaken me for one of the followers of the path. I am a man of peace, like Lud himself wanted. I apologize if my words distress you, but at the same time you must be aware that those impure machines you have within you are an anathema to us." "I'm well aware, brother," Varuna replied coldly, "but unfortunately I didn't have any choice on the matter. The men who installed them made their decision for me, so I apologize if my augmentations offend you, but the last thing I want is someone assaulting me in a back alley with demands to dismantle them, which, by the way, would probably either kill me or make me incapable of even basic functions." The priest was clearly taken aback with this abrupt reply, but he quickly regained his composure. "I see," he said sympathetically, "but I didn't want to make any demands of you, sister. After all, this is not the Lud's way. Yes, some of our more radical brethren believe that the message of the Chosen One should be spread with violence, but where does that path lead? If I threatened you with violence and demanded your repentance here and now, would your conversion be true? No, sister, it would be nothing but a lie. A true change must come from within yourself, and I wish to talk to you to perhaps present a different point of view. I can see now, however, that I've been mistaken. I have gazed upon you, saw your mechanical parts, and made a foolish assumption that, like every other man or woman who betray their humanity for cold machinery, you were nothing but an arrogant hypocrite. But I sensed pain in your words, and I feel sorry that these modifications were imposed on you. I shall not mention this matter anymore. You have my word. Varuna nodded, releasing her breath. The man was surprisingly reasonable for a Ludic priest, which she thought was probably the reason he was preaching to random strangers in back alleys instead of leading his own congregation. She was about to say something vague and end the conversation, but just as she was opening her mouth, the man smiled again, and, as she noticed, this time his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Unfortunately," he said, suddenly cold, "while I may be a man of peace, there are many of my brothers and sisters who do not always follow Lud's word on the matter, and they may have issues with your chrome, young lady, no matter where it came from. And their issues may even rise into actual grievances if they knew that you defiled their stations by trading with known heretics." All of a sudden, more people appeared in the alley, heavily armed and armored people. Paladins, Varuna thought. 2, 6, no, 12 of them. A half of that number she probably could take on with her flimsy pistol, if they didn't know she was coming. In open combat, however, especially in this cramped alley, she stood no chance. She turned back to the priest, who was reading some passage from his holy book, showing that he had full control of the situation. He looked back at her and offered the same cold smile as before, as if waiting for her to say something. Varuna decided to not give him the satisfaction, though, and just stayed quiet. The alley remained silent for almost a minute, when the man finally lost his patience, closed his book and said, "Well, sister, I admire your spirits. And, as I said, I do not intend to cause you trouble, but at the same time I simply cannot overlook your transgressions against the faithful." "Of course you can't. So what do you want? If you wanted to make an example out of me, your gorillas would have knocked me out already." "Nonsense. They are here, just like myself, to provide a different perspective on certain things, namely, on the offer I have for you, sister." These words came as a surprise. Varuna genuinely believed she was about to take part in a witch hunt, but the man seemed serious, so she just nodded for him to continue. "As you might have noticed, the sector has been rather chaotic lately. Hegemony seems to be up in arms about something, and they stirred quite a hornet's nest by the devastation of Garnier's spaceport. I do not mean to say that I have much sympathy for the brigands who inhabited it, but wanton slaughter on such a scale is almost never a good choice, and unfortunately we're all paying the price of this heavy-handed action." "If you want me to hunt down pirates, you clearly haven't seen the ships we brought to port," Varuna interrupted. "Cat Logistics is not a mercenary company, but, well, a logistics one." "Indeed, and as it happens, we have precisely a job someone of your caliber may find interesting. We want you to find a group of the faithful who went on a pilgrimage away from the core systems to a place called Togar. And to show you a token of goodwill, the church is even willing to pay you for it. 100,000 escrets if you bring the pilgrims back. Half of that for information about them. I'd say it's more than a reasonable deal, wouldn't you say, sister?" "I could say that, yes, but I'm more inclined to ask where the catch is." "There is none. The pilgrims in question are dear to me. They are dear to the whole church, and because of High Hegemon's stand on Corvus system, our fleets are busy, because every pirate across the sector is now gunning for revenge. And since this is an important job, I'd rather hand it to someone I can be sure will accomplish it." "How can you be so sure we'll do it? What's stopping us from just leaving and not coming back?" "Reason, of course. I'm sure you wouldn't want to learn that you and your entire company has been marked as known heretics and criminals by the church and all its friends." Varuna didn't need to think about that. Being locked out by the entire Ludic church would cause more harm than good, and certainly wouldn't be worth it, just to show defiance to one priest. "Fine then," she finally said. "And if we do that, all is forgiven?" "I cannot forgive you, sister. Only God can. But I can forget your sins, if I'll see true will to repent in your actions. Who knows, you may even find enlightenment on your pilgrimage to Togar. Now go, sister. Oh, and I look forward to seeing you during sermon sometime." The priest signaled the paladins and they all left the alley, leaving Varuna Europa alone in silence. "Very smooth, Jarbrain," she chastised herself. She really could have dealt with this conversation a lot better, but Luddite preachers always annoyed all sense out of her. Well, at least there was a promise of payment at the end of it, so convincing Mr. Cart to go there shouldn't be much of a problem. But at the same time, she really, truly didn't want to go out there, into unexplored reaches of the sector. Once again, it seemed someone made the decision for her, which angered her even more. She sent the recording of entire conversation back to her boss. She turned it on when she noticed the paladins, but didn't risk streaming it live through her implants. If they had some means of tracking the transmission, they'd probably not be happy about it. Granted, Varuna's entire existence was pretty much an epitome of sin to followers of Lud, but there was no need to make the situation worse. But Mr. Cart had other things on his mind. As his second-in-command returned, he immediately caught her and said, "Hey, Missy, look what I found on the sale in the shipyard." She looked at the screen. It was a schematic of a Wayfarer-class freighter, a ship that immediately filled her with nostalgia. "Looks almost like the one we flew when we first walked together," she said. "Yeah, that's why I noticed it. And it's in a good shape too. Gonna be useful no matter what we plan to do, so I guess this is our new flagship now." Varuna smiled. "We're gonna have to give her a good name, boss." And so, CLS Second Chance came into existence, a name which contained all hope of those two miserable drifters, hope for restoring everything they lost to the void. Of course, they still had a long way to go, but for the very first time since they returned to civilization, they both felt like they're truly back on their feet. For a moment, they both looked into the future with optimism, and then Varuna told Mr. Cart about the deal she made with the priest, and their entire good mood went to hell.